It was an unusually hot morning in the small town of Brookwood, and the sound of construction echoed through the air. Jackhammers thudded rhythmically against the pavement, cranes groaned as they lifted steel beams into place, and workers shouted commands to one another. Amidst all the chaos and clamor, something small, frightened, and unnoticed skittered around the edges of the site, a tiny, golden puppy. His name, for now, was just Puppy. He didn't have an owner, or any idea of where he was. He only knew that he had wandered far from home and now found himself in a terrifying, unfamiliar place. His tiny heart pounded in his chest as he scampered between piles of gravel and scraps of metal, his wide eyes darting in every direction, desperately searching for a safe place to hide. The construction workers, busy with their tasks, barely noticed the little dog. Some of them saw the puppy, but thought nothing of it, just another stray, they assumed, too busy to pay attention to the small, trembling creature. But for Puppy, it was like being trapped in a maze of dangers. The loud bangs and clanging sounds made him shake in fear. He wasn't sure if the huge machines would eat him up or if he might be crushed by a falling beam. His tiny paws left no trace on the dusty ground, and his coat, once soft and shiny, was now matted with dirt and grime from the construction site. As hours passed, Puppy grew more and more disoriented. He had tried to find a way out, but every time he thought he might escape, another noise would frighten him back into the shadows. He whimpered softly, but there was no one to hear. His stomach growled, and he realized he hadn't eaten for a long time. His fear and exhaustion were beginning to take a toll on him, but he had no idea where to go or how to get help. And just as hope began to fade, something unexpected happened. A woman, wearing a bright yellow vest and holding a clipboard, stepped onto the site. Her name was Emma. She was the project manager for the construction, but she had grown tired of the noise and mess of the project. She stepped away from the bustle, searching for a quiet moment of peace. As she wandered to the far corner of the site, her eyes caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows. At first, she thought it was a rat. But as she got closer, she realized it was much smaller and more helpless than that. There, huddled against a steel beam, was the puppy. His fur was matted with dust, his body shaking, and his eyes wide with fear. Emma's heart immediately went out to the tiny creature. She knelt down carefully, trying to be as gentle as possible. The last thing she wanted was to frighten him further. "Hey there, little one," she said softly, holding out her hand. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The puppy flinched, his body tensing at the sound of her voice. He was afraid. He had no idea who this person was, and she seemed so much bigger than him. But something in her tone reassured him. Slowly, hesitantly, he took a small step toward her. Emma smiled softly and stayed as still as possible. She didn't want to scare him away. It took several long minutes before the puppy finally approached her outstretched hand. Emma, knowing that he was frightened and fragile, gently scooped him up. His small body shivered in her arms, but he didn't struggle. He simply let out a small, pitiful whine as she cradled him against her chest. "You're safe now," Emma whispered, her voice a calming lull. "Don't worry. I'll take care of you." Emma had always loved animals, and something about this small, trembling puppy struck her deeply. She couldn't just leave him there, alone and scared. She had to help. Without wasting another moment, Emma carried the puppy back through the construction site, avoiding the noisy machinery and workers. She made her way to her car, where she gently placed the puppy in the passenger seat. "We're going to get you somewhere safe," she promised. It wasn't long before they arrived at the local animal shelter. Emma hurried inside, holding the puppy close to her chest. The shelter workers, seeing the state of the tiny dog, immediately took action. They rushed him to the back room, where they carefully examined him for injuries and gave him a warm bath to wash away the dirt and dust that clung to his fur. The puppy shivered and whimpered, still uncertain about the kind strangers who surrounded him. But the calm, kind voices of the shelter workers were a comfort. They gave him food and water, and after a while, he began to settle down. As the day drew to a close, the little puppy was resting in a cozy bed, surrounded by soft blankets. Emma sat beside him for a while, her heart aching for the fear he had experienced. She could only hope that with time, he would learn to trust people again. But for now, the most important thing was that the puppy was safe. Days passed, and the puppy, still nameless, slowly adjusted to the warmth and security of the shelter. The shelter staff, who had named him Rusty due to the reddish tint of his coat, were patient with him. They could tell that the little dog was still scared and unsure of everything around him, but he was beginning to show signs of improvement. Rusty would wag his tail hesitantly when someone approached, although he was still quick to retreat to his bed whenever there was a loud noise. Emma, who visited the shelter every day, couldn't help but grow attached to the little dog. She would sit with him, speaking softly and offering him treats, but she knew that Rusty needed more than just her attention. He needed a family who could help him recover from the trauma he'd experienced. A family who would give him a home and the time he needed to heal. One afternoon, as Emma was sitting in the shelter's small office, she overheard a conversation between two potential adopters. A young couple, Sarah and Tom, had come to the shelter looking for a dog. They had recently lost their elderly dog, Buddy, who had been a loyal companion for many years. After his passing, the couple had decided they were ready to welcome a new dog into their lives, but they wanted one who needed a little extra love and care. "I think we might be the perfect fit," Sarah was saying to one of the shelter workers. "We've had dogs before, and we know it takes time for them to adjust. We just want to give a dog a second chance." The shelter worker smiled. "Well, we do have a little one who could really use some help. He's been through quite a lot. His name is Rusty." Sarah's eyes lit up when she heard the name. "Rusty? Tell me more about him." The worker led them to Rusty's kennel, and as soon as Sarah and Tom saw him, their hearts melted. The little puppy was curled up in a bed, his wide brown eyes watching them cautiously. He looked so small and vulnerable, and there was no doubt in their minds that he needed someone who would understand his fears and help him overcome them. "We'll take him," Tom said gently, kneeling down to Rusty's level. "He just needs a chance. And we're willing to give him that." The shelter worker nodded, her smile wide. "I'm sure he'll be in good hands with you. But I do want to warn you, Rusty is still very shy. He's been through a lot, and it might take him some time to feel safe again. Be patient with him." "We will," Sarah promised, her voice soft but firm. "We understand." And so, after completing all the paperwork, Sarah and Tom took Rusty home. He was still trembling in their arms as they drove away from the shelter, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the place where he could feel safe again. The first few days at Sarah and Tom's home were difficult for Rusty. He spent most of his time hiding in the corner of the living room, trembling at every sound. The doorbell, the creak of the floorboards, even the sound of a car driving by outside made him flinch. He had no interest in playing or eating, and every attempt to comfort him seemed to make him even more scared. He would pull away from them, his body stiff with fear, his eyes wide as if he was expecting something bad to happen at any moment. But Sarah and Tom were patient. They didn't push him. Instead, they spent their time sitting quietly near him, letting him come to them when he was ready. Sarah would sit with him on the couch, reading aloud from her favorite books, her voice soothing and calm. Tom would sit across from him, gently tossing a ball or offering him a treat, letting Rusty see that he had nothing to fear. They never rushed him, never forced him into anything. They understood that Rusty had been through too much to expect instant progress. At night, they set up a cozy crate for him in their bedroom, making sure he had his own space where he could feel safe. It wasn't much, but it was a place that was his, where he could rest without worrying about the loud noises of the outside world. At first, Rusty refused to sleep in the crate. He would whimper, pacing around the room and trying to escape. But Sarah and Tom didn't give up. They kept the crate open, letting him explore it on his own terms. One evening, after several days of quiet encouragement, Rusty finally crawled into the crate on his own. He curled up in a ball, and for the first time since arriving at their home, he fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Sarah and Tom watched him from their bed, both of them silently relieved. "We're getting there," Tom whispered, his voice full of hope. Over the next few weeks, Rusty continued to make slow but steady progress. He started to eat more regularly, and Sarah and Tom began to see glimpses of the dog he could become. He would tentatively wag his tail when they called his name, and once in a while, he would even bring them a toy, his way of showing that he was starting to trust them. But it was one rainy afternoon, a few weeks after his arrival, that something remarkable happened. Sarah had just finished a long day of work and was sitting on the couch, exhausted. Rusty, who had been watching her from his favorite spot across the room, suddenly padded over to her, his little paws making soft tapping sounds on the floor. He stopped in front of her, looking up with those wide, brown eyes, and then, to Sarah's surprise, he gently nudged her hand with his nose. Sarah's heart swelled. She knew that this was the moment when Rusty was finally starting to trust them completely. "Hi, sweet boy," she whispered, bending down to pet him. He leaned into her touch, his body relaxing for the first time in a long while. And when Sarah reached down to lift him into her lap, he didn't pull away. Instead, he settled into her arms, curling up as though he had finally found a place where he could truly feel safe. It wasn't going to be easy. Rusty still had a long way to go before he would fully overcome his fears, but this was a huge step forward. And Sarah and Tom were determined to help him every step of the way. Months passed, and Rusty's transformation was nothing short of remarkable. With each passing day, he grew more comfortable in his new home, surrounded by love, patience, and understanding. Sarah and Tom watched with pride as their little puppy blossomed into a confident, playful dog. The terrified, trembling creature they had brought home from the shelter had slowly but surely learned to trust, and that trust was slowly mending the broken pieces of his spirit. Rusty, once so afraid of every noise, now enjoyed the sound of his humans' voices. He would eagerly wag his tail when Tom came home from work, his ears perking up when Sarah spoke his name. The two of them had learned how to read his body language, recognizing when he was still uncertain and when he was ready to take a new step forward. Rusty had begun to explore his world more bravely, sniffing at the backyard flowers, chasing after his toys, and even happily jumping into the car whenever Sarah and Tom announced it was time for a ride. But it wasn't all sunshine and wagging tails. Rusty still had his moments, times when the past would creep back into his mind, and fear would cloud his eyes. A sudden bang from the kitchen, the sharp sound of a thunderstorm, or the roar of a lawnmower outside would sometimes send him into a panic. On these occasions, Rusty would retreat to his safe corner, trembling again as if all the progress had been undone. Sarah and Tom didn't get frustrated. They knew that healing wasn't linear, and that every setback was just another part of the journey. Instead of pushing him, they allowed him to work through his fears in his own time. They'd sit by him during thunderstorms, comforting him with gentle strokes and soft murmurs, reassuring him that no harm was coming. When the lawnmower roared, they'd quietly walk outside with him, showing him there was nothing to fear. The most significant moment came one quiet evening when Sarah and Tom decided to take Rusty to the park. It had been a long time since they'd gone for a walk in public places. Rusty had always been too shy, too hesitant to venture outside of the safety of his home. But today, Sarah felt that it was time. Rusty was ready to take on the world again, at his own pace. With a leash securely fastened to his collar, Rusty stood at the door, his eyes fixed on the outside world. He could hear the sound of children laughing in the distance, and the chirping of birds in the trees. But it was all so new to him, and even though he had made great strides, there was still a small part of him that hesitated. Tom crouched down next to him, rubbing his back gently. "Are you ready, buddy?" he asked softly. "You don't have to do it if you're not ready. We'll go at your pace." Rusty's tail twitched slightly, and after a long pause, he took a hesitant step toward the door. It was as though he had gathered all his courage for this one moment. Slowly, with Sarah leading the way, Rusty stepped outside. The world seemed so vast. The street was full of sounds, cars passing by, people chatting, children playing, and the rustling of leaves. For a moment, Rusty froze, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of everything happening at once. His body tensed, and he looked up at Sarah with wide eyes, unsure of what to do next. But then, Sarah squatted down in front of him, her face full of warmth and encouragement. "You're doing great, Rusty. We're here with you. You're safe." With a deep breath, Rusty moved forward again, his paws tentative but steady. He passed by a couple of other dogs who were also out for a walk. At first, he stiffened, but as they approached, he gave a soft sniff, his tail wagging ever so slightly. Rusty looked back up at Sarah, as if asking for confirmation. "See," she said softly, her voice filled with pride. "It's not so bad, is it?" By the time they reached the park, Rusty was walking with a little more confidence. The sight of the wide, open space seemed to ease his nerves, and for the first time in a long while, he trotted around happily, sniffing at the grass and chasing after a few fallen leaves. His body was no longer tense, and his ears were perked up in curiosity as he explored the new environment. He wasn't quite the playful, fearless dog he would eventually become, but this was a big step forward. It was a moment of triumph, both for him and for Sarah and Tom. The rest of the walk was just as peaceful. They stopped to rest under a tree, and Rusty lay contentedly at their feet, his eyes half closed in relaxation. For the first time in his life, he seemed at peace with the world around him. That evening, after returning home from the park, Rusty curled up in his favorite spot in the living room, his head resting on the soft rug. Sarah and Tom exchanged a look of pure joy. This was their dog now, not the broken little puppy they had found in the construction yard, but a dog who had grown, healed, and learned to trust again. As Sarah rubbed his belly, Rusty let out a contented sigh, his tail thumping softly against the floor. "Look at him," Tom whispered, a hint of emotion in his voice. "We did it. He's home now." And in that moment, everything felt right. Rusty was no longer the fearful, abandoned puppy he once was. He had found his place in the world, and, most importantly, in their hearts. It wasn't long before Rusty became the heart and soul of their family. He no longer ran at the sound of thunder, nor did he hide from strangers. He had learned to trust again, to love again, and with every wag of his tail, he showed Sarah and Tom just how grateful he was for the life they had given him. And while his journey to heal from his past had been long and full of challenges, Rusty had found something more precious than safety. He had found love, and love, it turned out, was all he had ever needed to make him whole again. The story of a lost puppy, wandering in fear, had come full circle, a story of rescue, healing, and a love that conquered all.